Thank you, Marceline, and thank you to the IIC for giving us what we call in the United States a safe space to talk about a range of issues that have no easy answers. So at the risk of dating myself, I was thinking as I was preparing to come over here and taking a look at the code of being in Brussels many years ago and meeting with Jean-Michel Hubert, who at the time was the head of ART and the head of, I can't remember if they called it then ERG or IRG, I am dating myself with the acronyms, but he shared with us a draft of what I think must have been the predecessor to the predecessor of the code that you're talking about now. And I looked at it and I said, so do you all know what you're going to do about regulating VoIP? And he said, no. Do you know what you're going to do about regulating VoIP? And so we're still here having a lot of those same conversations 20 years later. So we have many people in the audience and on the panel who are much more expert in the particulars of the code that you all are finalizing. And so I thought that I would instead move it up a level and talk about some of the persistent themes that we're dealing with in the U.S. that I think are also being dealt with in the EU, to be able to tease out some of the similarities and the differences between our approaches. And I thought I'd focus on three areas. First is connectivity, second, cybersecurity, security, and then the third, the role of ICT in society and in our democracies. So everyone agrees that we want everyone online. We want sustainable development in the infrastructure. We want to get everybody connected so that we can promote equality and economic growth throughout our countries. I remember when I was at the FCC, and we were talking about this at the cocktail reception last night, wishing that we could do our best, whatever the issue was, do our best coming up with the best answer we could, try it as an experiment, then reevaluate it in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, figure out what worked, what didn't, be very express about that endeavor, and then adjust the things that didn't work. The problem is, as many people know as a regulator, it's very difficult to do that. It's awkward once you've started down a path to reverse it. It's oftentimes expensive to do that, and it upsets expectations. But what's been fascinating to me over the last several years is looking at a natural experiment that we have going on between what has happened with regulation of the broadband networks in the United States, the EU, and I think Australia, with acknowledgement to our head of the IIC, presents a third option, which is fascinating, but we probably don't have time for Australia today. So in the US, we had a very, very aggressive wholesale access unbundling regime that was applied when I was in the FCC that required much wholesale access to try to spur local telephone competition. That was very deliberately not extended to broadband service. So we set that aside, did not do any wholesale access or rate regulation for broadband access. In the EU, you extended the general wholesale access obligations that you had for the telephone service over to the broadband services, and that is, I think, the experiment that we've had in the real world that we can take a look at. So if I could have the slide, please. So the different government approaches led to different outcomes. In the U.S., ISPs invested $1.5 trillion in infrastructure across technology since 1996. That continued even through the recession. And in the U.S., Verizon, AT&T, and Comcast have been 3 of the top 10 investors inside the U.S. Not coincidentally, we're also very major debt holders. In the EU, there was an initial explosion in retail-based competitors offering low retail rates, and I think that competitors wrung everything they could out of the copper network, but that ended up, I think, overall suppressing investment. So the most recent data, this is from Christopher Yu, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania. I think a lot of people have seen his statistics. He published a study that concluded with data from 2013, and so I wrote to him as I was preparing to come here and asked him if he had any occasion to update the numbers, because I was curious to see if the gap had widened or if it had narrowed since he had published a study, and he sent this to me and with permission said that I could make it available excuse me, and what it shows is that the gap in investment per household has actually widened. So instead of being double in the U.S., we're now 3 times higher per household investment. So a stark difference in terms of, a stark and increasing difference in terms of investment. And those different investments have led to different outcomes on deployment. In the EU, 98% of households now have access to fixed broadband services that are below 30 megabits per second, largely through DSL. 3/4 of EU households have fixed access at 30 or more. The numbers aren't completely comparable because we have different thresholds that we use to report to the government, but this is the closest we can do. And roughly half of EU households have access to speeds of 100 megabits per second or more. On the US side, nearly all households have access to 10 megabits per second, which is the speed that the US government, that the FCC has set to qualify for subsidies for universal service. So that's what's meant to be acceptable, not aspirational, but acceptable speeds for broadband service. And then nearly all Americans have access to the higher speeds of at least 25 megabits per second since June 2016. And at speeds above 100 megabits per second, you see the EU-US gap is wider. More than 85% of US households have access to networks that are capable of 100 megabits per second, compared to about half of the EU. So in the US, Comcast, the company that I'm with now, we're starting to roll out gigabit speeds with our DOCSIS 3.1 upgrades, and we plan to have gigabit speeds available to the majority of our homes by the end of the year. So in the US, so that's all the good news. There are 2 points of bad news in the US. First is the remaining connectivity problems are really hard to fix, and they're very, very expensive. In part, that's because we have very low population density in the US. We have 35 people per square kilometer in the US compared to 122 in France, 375 here in Belgium, and about 500 in the Netherlands. So not surprisingly, the areas that don't have access in the US are those with low population density. Density is just the enemy of getting connectivity across. So in urban areas, only about 2% lack access to 25 compared to 28% in rural America, and the problem is most acute in our tribal lands, which is a intransigent and horrible problem. We've had good progress even in the rural areas with, over the last 2.5 years, the proportion of households that don't have access has been cut by nearly a third. But it remains a challenge, and as Commissioner O'Reilly and his colleagues are working on trying to figure out how to spur deployment in those final areas that have not been served. The second challenge we have is adoption, just getting people who have access to get online. We look about the same between the EU and the US. 3/4 roughly of the people who have access to connectivity have actually subscribed to broadband. And it's here too, I think the problem is that those remaining unconnected people are really, really hard to get at. We are, about 2/3 of the people in the US say that they wouldn't take broadband even if it were free. And part of this is it ends up tying to a lot of issues of structural poverty as well. So what we have in the US is most of the unconnected, not surprisingly, are older and rural, Hispanic and African American, but the real disparity is on education level. As you can see here, adoption is about 90% for those with a bachelor college degree or higher, but only a little over half for individuals with less than a college degree. So we at Comcast are 5 years into a program to try to spur internet adoption. It's called Internet Essentials. I'm happy to talk to anybody about it after the session. It focused on a pilot project that gives connectivity to households that are poor households with children in school. It was meant to try to address the homework divide, we call it. And so we offer a service that's about $10 a month with a reduced laptop, computer, and digital literacy training. We, as I said, are 5 years into that, and this year we announced that we had connected our millionth household, so we're roughly 4 million people that are low-income people that we've connected. We've started doing pilot projects for people in public housing and in community colleges as well. So the point is that remaining connectivity gap is really, really difficult for us. If it weren't difficult, it would be solved. So we need innovation and policies and strategies. I would say we need both industries and regulators that are 4.0 or 5.0 to figure out new tools to get this hard stuff done. So quickly, security. We are, which I realize is not strictly speaking part of the code, but when you talk to anybody who is looking at this space, the Internet Society did an interesting survey across the globe and they published their results this year. Clearly, the most important issue, probably neck and neck with connectivity, but perhaps more, is figuring out how to secure our networks. I mean, the way I think about it is we've built this internet that was never meant really to support everything that we've put on its shoulders. It is an open network by design, but that makes the security problems even more challenging. We're in a war with hackers, and we're frankly losing the war. So I know that in the EU, there's been a proposal to consolidate, I think, if I'm correct, into one agency oversight of how to address cybersecurity. We have in the US a lot of discussion about where to locate that oversight as well. Sometimes it feels like just moving the deck chairs on the Titanic to figure out who is going to be leading this, and it may be different in the EU, but in the US, every government agency wants to have a seat at the table dealing with cybersecurity, in part because they need to show that they're doing something responsible. It makes it very difficult, even for companies of our size, to be able to track and participate in all those different venues. So I do think it's very important to try to streamline and consolidate where in the government you're focusing that effort. The second point on cybersecurity is if the hacking that we've seen so far is bad, it's going to do nothing but get worse with the Internet of Things coming up. We have a problem that we don't have an easy answer to, which is we're going to have all these devices hooked up to the Internet, but many of them are coming from companies and startups that have absolutely no incentive to do basic security into those devices. And we don't know yet really how to address that. There's an organization in the US called BTAG. It's an acronym for something. It's based at the University of Colorado. And they did a good report that showed how to basic hygiene, basic security practices that Internet of Things should do. The problem is it's not at all clear what incentives some of the smaller players have to even do that. So that's the second point. The third point is that more than probably any other area, this is an area that needs global cooperation. Exactly what that means, I think we don't know yet, and I think most of us are still addressing it at very high-level statements of principle, but we need to keep on working together both at the government level and at the industry level. And then finally, content. There's so much to say on this. I think it goes to, and again, this is not inside the four corners of the code, but in the United States, I would say this has been, within the ICT sector, the single most heated discussion that we've been having. This is the first time in my memory that we have been having open discussions about how to deal with what have been truly revolting examples of hate speech, sexism, racism that are going on the internet. We are struggling with looking at a lot of the intrusion that happened in the government election and the presidential election, both in hacking, but in also perpetuating a lot of fake news that people are struggling with right now, and in figuring out how, in particular in the US, with the very strong First Amendment commitment that we have, that's almost foundational to us, how to stay faithful to those principles of freedom of speech and yet deal with what we're recognizing are really ill effects in society on what's happening over that platform. So as the internet becomes more and more critical to more and more people's lives, I think the key issue for both industry and regulators is how we work together to make sure we're getting the best out of this for all of our people without accepting all the worst. So thank you.